Welcome to Fargo Effects. It's been a while since I did a build. I must apologize. This will actually be, for those who are paying close attention, this is a rerun of a build that I did before. But you can see this knife here that I made. This is, the idea was to just build a grungy looking post-apocalypse kind of knife. But to do it from a quality steel, in this case remnants from a lawnmower blade, and to use my gas forge to do it, which actually hasn't seen a lot of use, but this is one of the knives I made with it. And actually a very functional knife. I think when it all gets done and you see how it was done, you'll see that it should be durable and sharp and capable. So enjoy the show. Thank you very much for watching, and I will have more videos to come. There's a lot of stuff going on at the Fargo Effects compound right now, but I have not forgotten about the channel. I really, really love all you guys. Thank you so much for your support, and there will be more content coming. So enjoy. So to begin with, I'm firing up my gas forge. That was interesting. I wasn't trying to do that, but it was kind of cool. Anyway, I'm firing up the gas forge. This is one of the forges that I've used. This is kind of my latest build. I do have another video if you're interested in checking it out. It's actually one of my most popular videos that shows you can really build a forge in your backyard for practically nothing, and you can do it in about half an hour. So if you do need to build a forge, I would recommend checking out that video, and I will put a link right up here. Now, there are a couple of ways I could secure this piece for the forging that I'm going to do. One way that you'll often see blacksmiths use is they'll just weld on a piece of scrap, maybe a piece of rebar or something onto the end of it, or else they'll use tongs. I've found that tongs, at least for me, they tend to loosen up, and they don't really give me a very good purchase on the workpiece. So I'll actually be using a set of locking vice grips. And these work really, really well, especially if you don't need to reposition. You know, some things you might be working on when you're blacksmithing or forging, you may have to reposition quite a bit. And for that purpose, I can see where tongs would definitely be advantageous. But in this case, I really just need something that I can hold on to it with and hold it in one position while I flatten out the scrap. I'm still kind of working on getting this gas forge to heat things evenly. It's a work in progress, but it will definitely work for what I need it to do. You'll see here I'm just bringing it up to a forging temperature, maybe a cherry red, and then pounding it with a hammer. Nothing real fancy here. Mainly you just want to make sure that you're taking sort of steady, even blows, and every once in a while you stop to make sure that you aren't, warping things sort of out of shape, or winding up with maybe a thin spot in the metal or something. But it's really pretty easy to do this. I don't necessarily have a lot of forging skill, but I can flatten out a piece of steel like this pretty easily. There are special tools you can use to do this if you want to get a really flat blade and you don't want any marks on there. For my purposes, I'm actually going for kind of a grungy urban apocalypse look, so I'm going to be leaving hammer marks in the blade, and you'll actually see me adding some hammer marks later just to really give it a lot of character. Once I have this flattened out adequately, I'm going to bring it over to my bench vise. I noticed that there was some type of surface, I don't know if it was oxidation or what was built up on the outside of this. I should note that the type of steel they use in lawnmower blades is often a heavily alloyed steel, meaning that there will be other metals that are in it. I'm not sure what this white sort of residue is on the outside. On the outside chance that there's some zinc or something involved here, I try to keep good ventilation going. You don't want to breathe very much zinc fumes because you can really, really get sick. For the small amount of work that I was doing here, I don't think was a very big concern. Also, I would guess it probably isn't zinc. It's probably some other metal that just happens to have a whitish oxidation to it. Anyway, I did clean that up with a wire brush attachment on this drill. And you'll see that after I cleaned up the surface a little bit, I did bring it back to the anvil and tried a couple of different hammers just to give some different hammer marks and add a little bit of character to it. Also, it's relatively cool now, so if there's any sort of subtle small bends that are still in the steel, it's a lot easier to straighten those out now than when it's really, really hot. If it's hot, you can wind up sort of overcompensating and moving the metal a little too much. But when it's a little cooler, as long as you don't wail on it and crack the metal, you can often correct minor bends or other imperfections when the steel is relatively cool. So once I'm satisfied with that, it's time to think a little bit about the design. Of course, I could have made a cleaver out of this. It's practically cleaver shaped already, but that was what I did last time, so I decided to go for a little bit different shape. I'm not exactly sure what to call this. It's kind of an urban apocalypse fighting knife looking thing. I think it might be a stretch, but you could probably call it a stylized Tonto blade. There will be a couple of different sort of blade facets at the front, and I'm going for angles that would lend themselves to just a lot of strength, not something that's going to break very easily. So for the next several minutes, it'll probably only be about 30 seconds of the video, but for the next several minutes I just spent time shaping, reshaping, testing how it felt in my hand, and making little adjustments and tweaks here and there until I had a knife that felt good in my hand and also where I liked the look of it. I won't say it looks good, it's an ugly knife, but it is really supposed to have that ugly factor to it. I will mention here, because it's been brought up a couple of times, if you watch me use an angle grinder, don't necessarily follow techniques that you see me using. There are a lot of times where, in order to get the shot that I want, to get the camera in the right position, to kind of show you what I'm doing, I'm really not observing proper safety. So definitely don't just emulate what you see me doing. Make sure that you're familiar with how to use an angle grinder, and that you're using techniques that really are safe and that are, recommended by the manufacturer. An angle grinder is a very powerful tool. It's moving at extremely high RPM, and as I've mentioned before a few times, I've been nicked pretty bad by an angle grinder, and so far I've been kind of fortunate that I haven't done any damage to an eye or any serious damage to my hands or anything. But it's one of the more useful tools in a metal shop. But it's also one of the more dangerous tools. You really have to respect that and always observe proper safety when you're using a grinder. One other word about safety. I know I mention this probably in just about every video I make, but really do invest in a good respirator. When you're working with tools like this, you are throwing a lot of tiny, tiny particles into the air. Make sure to protect your lungs. So I invested in a good 3M respirator. It's not very expensive. You can buy them locally. I think they probably run anywhere around $20, $25 if you get them at a hardware store of some kind. I ordered mine off of Amazon. I will include the link in the description below. I do have an Amazon affiliate account, so if you follow that link and make a purchase, I will get a small commission. But regardless of whether you use my link, please do invest in a good respirator and protect your lungs. So once I have the shape roughed out with the grinder, I'm going to take this over to the 1x30, clean up the edges, make a few last minute adjustments, and then I'm going to put in the bevels. You'll see me using gloves here. I'm doing that because the metal is still pretty hot from using the other grinder. I don't necessarily recommend using gloves when you're working with high-speed equipment like this. It's really personal choice. I know that people have been injured by getting gloves caught in equipment that's moving quickly and then their hand gets pulled in. And one thing I happen to know about this particular model of 1x30, at least the one that I own, it's really not very powerful. It doesn't take much to stop it from spinning altogether. With that said, make sure that you're doing what you can to protect your hands. You really only have one set of hands, and if you screw them up, it's going to be pretty hard to make knives after that. Once I have the bevels taken down to maybe a little over 1/16 of an inch, I'm actually going to normalize the piece before I harden it. So I'm putting this in the forge, working it back and forth a little bit, getting the metal heated back up to a nice bright red, and then I'll close up the forge, leave the knife in there, and just let it cool very slowly. And what this does is it helps to relax any stresses that have been induced into the metal through any of the work that I've done so far, and in the end it should result in a much more even heat treat when I go to heat it up and quench it. I probably left it in there for a couple of hours so it was good and cool, and then I fired the forge back up again. You'll see me turning off some lights in the shop so you can get a sense of the real color of the metal, the glow of the metal. I'm going for a cherry red. That should be in the neighborhood of 1500 degrees. That's about where I want it to do my quench. I am going to do a differential quench. I don't want the spine of the knife to be hardened. I just want the edges to be hardened. So I'm using kind of a shallow water container, and I will plunge mainly just the point and the edges into that water. I didn't really have the camera set up at a very good angle for you to see what was going on here, but I did get the sort of differential quench I was going for, and I also managed to make a pretty good mess in the process. So once the quench is done, I will transfer this to my super high-tech heat treating oven. This is actually it's a toaster oven that I got for around 20 or 25 bucks, but it works. To temper this, I'm going to do 2 cycles at 450 degrees. This isn't a real thick piece of metal, so I'm only doing 35 or 40 minutes per cycle. Everybody has their own way of doing this. Since this is a mystery metal anyway, I don't feel like I need to follow any particular guidelines, so I'm kind of doing what has worked for me in the past. Once the blade is tempered and I've let it cool back down again, it's time to take it to the belt grinder to do the final bit of work on the bevel and the edge. Of course, this is going to be hard on belts because this now is a very hard steel relative to the much softer steel I was working with before, but there really is no way around it. Because if you get the blade too thin before you do the quench, you're almost guaranteed to get some type of warping or cracking when you quench it. Now for this video, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on technique. I will say that even after a year of doing this, I'm still developing my skills at putting a good bevel in or putting a good edge in. Probably the main thing I focus on is going slowly, trying to get a feel for where that bevel is as I push into the belt, and then drawing it slowly and evenly across, making sure to maintain one consistent angle. One of the nice things about making this style of knife, where there's a lot of hammer marks and there's just a lot of character in the blade, is that if you do have any minor screw-ups while you're putting in the bevel or putting in the edge, a lot of that is kind of covered up by the other marks and things in the blade. But regardless, as a general rule, I think it's a good idea to do the very best you can on each knife you're working on, because really the more you concentrate, the more you focus on good technique, the better you're going to get. You'll see me working a little bit along the back of the knife here. I'm not sharpening that. I really don't have a use for having the backside sharpened, but I do like to have that sort of false edge there. To get a good sharp edge, I'll often go to a higher grit belt. There are a lot of ways to put an edge on a knife. You can use stones. There are all kinds of kits that are sold. For my purposes for this video, I'm satisfied just with a fine grit belt. So now it's time to put scales on the knife. And again, there are a lot of ways you could do this. I'm going to use the same material that I used for the last video. I really like this rubber tread material. It's very grippy. It's very easy to work with. It cuts nicely, it trims and sands nicely, and it's just a peel and stick material, so it's really easy to work with. I will say that if you want a more permanent installation of a material like this, there are a couple of ways you could do it. One, you could use something to strip off the glue and then use a more permanent glue like an epoxy. And of course, another way is once you have the grips on the knife and you have them shaped the way you want them, you could drill holes through and put in pins or screws to hold them in place. You know, for me, this is probably not a knife I'm going to be using a lot. It's more of a showpiece. And so for that reason, I'm not really concerned about having a super permanent set of grips on the knife. If they ever do loosen up, I can always fix it. I should mention that I picked this material up at Harbor Freight. I imagine that's not the only place that sells them, but it's pretty inexpensive and it's just really, really convenient for this kind of an application. As you can see, it doesn't take much to cut it. Of course, I'll clean up the handle area of the knife just to make sure that this sticks really well. I could probably wipe it down with, like a cotton ball with some alcohol on it. It isn't really necessary as long as it's a pretty clean surface. And then once I have them in place, it's really just a matter of trimming them down to a shape that I like, and then working on kind of contouring the edges to make sure that it has a good feel in my hand and really gives me a good grip on the knife. So here basically is the finished knife. I'm not 100% satisfied with the look of this grip. I might do some more work on it. You can see there's some rough edges that need to be cleaned up. Some of the contours and stuff I may change a little bit. And again, that's one of the nice things about this material is it's really easy to work with. And honestly, if I did some more work on it and I screwed it up, I could just peel these off, cut out some new ones and stick them on there. And it doesn't take very much time and it costs practically nothing. So there's the finished knife. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I would love it if you threw me a like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment if you'd like. I'd love to get your feedback on this design. There's a lot of different aspects of this that are, kind of different than traditional knife making. So I'd love to hear your comments. Thanks again. Whoever you are, whatever you're doing, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you in the next video.